In May this year, Hollywood releases its latest epic. It's the story of the Trojan War.
There's a great will to believe that there was a Trojan War, and it was for the love of a beautiful woman.
But is any of it more than just a myth?
You have science on the one hand, and you have the imagination gone wild on the other.
Tonight, Horizon can reveal the latest scientific evidence about the real Troy.
There are skeletons. We found, for example, a girl, I think 16, 17 years old. It was a city which was besieged, and they were defeated.
The evidence comes from the written tablets of a lost civilization. An extraordinary shipwreck, and treasure uncovered at Troy itself.
The scientist collides with the romantic.
We show how science is taking us closer than ever to the truth behind one of the greatest stories of them all. For thousands of years, these tunnels have held a secret. Until now. They are carved into the bedrock of an ancient city in northwest Turkey. The marks of the workmen who made them still visible.
You see the burning still of the lamps up here, and the chisels which went into to make this cavity.
Archaeologist Manfred Kaufmann has come here with a new scientific technique that he hopes will uncover a truth about these tunnels. It may reveal something that many have suspected, but no one has been able to prove. His technique may take us closer than ever to the hard facts behind an ancient myth. The story of the Trojan War. It's one of the greatest love stories ever. Helen was the most beautiful woman in the world. She's married to a Greek king, but she's spirited away to the magnificent city of Troy after she's seduced by the Trojan prince, Paris. For the Greeks, this means war. Their most powerful king, Agamemnon, assembles an army. A 1,000 ships from all across Greece set sail to lay siege to Troy and bring back Helen. The siege drags on for 10 years. The Greeks cannot break Troy's great walls, so they resort to trickery. They leave a great wooden horse outside the city, and the Trojans pull it inside. Greek soldiers hidden in the horse jump out and open the city gates. Troy is then razed to the ground. The story was composed by the Greek poet Homer almost 3,000 years ago. It's so compelling that for centuries people wondered if any of it was true. Was there a war fought for love? Did a coalition of Greeks set sail? Did Troy even exist? Eric Klein is an archaeologist who has tried to answer these questions.
Is there any truth in this story? Is there a nugget, a kernel of truth at the base of the story around which everything else is wrapped. Is there some historical war which took place, which Homer wrapped in layer after layer after layer, so it became much more than just a single battle, a single conflict, much more than just a war. It became a story, an epic, a saga. And what we have to try and do is peel away the layers and get at the truth, if there is any there to find.
The first task was to find out when in history the legend was set. Most scholars accept that Homer composed the story in the 8th century before Christ. But it's thought that he was writing about a time hundreds of years earlier, sometime in the Age of Bronze. At the beginning of this era, the pyramids of Egypt were being built. Writing came to Greece. And the invention of bronze weapons revolutionized the face of warfare. It was in the late Bronze Age, around 1200 years before Christ, that it is believed the story of the Trojan War is set. Having determined the time, the task now facing archaeologists was to find out if Troy ever existed. The first breakthrough was made by Heinrich Schliemann in 1870. He was something of an amateur, but he had other qualities.
To be an archaeologist, you have to be both good and lucky. Schliemann was not necessarily that good, but he was luckier than almost anybody else that has ever put trowel or spade into the ground.
Schliemann looked for geographical clues in Homer to follow up. They placed Troy in the northwest corner of what is now Turkey. Schliemann believed they fitted the site of an ancient mound by the coast. He didn't hang around.
Schliemann shows up at the site, hires a couple hundred workers, and puts a whacking great trench right through the middle of the mound. And that was archaeology.
15 meters down, he found a walled palace with a paved ramp leading to a gate.
He found a great gate in stone with a great road leading through the gateway, wide enough so that 2 chariots could have driven through it side by side. And that is one of the clues that Homer gives.
Schliemann thought he'd found Homer's Troy. The rest of the world wasn't so sure. But in this trench, he answered the doubters with a breathtaking discovery. Treasure. Gold diadems. Jewels fit for the most beautiful woman in the world. Here was evidence of a rich and advanced culture.
He had found the very jewels, the very necklaces, bracelets, earrings that Helen had worn, or so he claimed. And so the world was absolutely entranced, especially when Schliemann put these necklaces, these jewels, on his wife, when he bedecked Sophie.
Schliemann had brought the myth dramatically to life. He was certain he'd found the mythical city of Troy, and the world wanted to believe him. But in fact, he'd got something completely wrong. A site that has been inhabited for centuries poses a particular problem for archaeologists. Because each generation builds on the remains of its predecessors, forming a sequence of layers. So the deeper you dig, the farther back in time you travel. At Troy, there are 9 layers, representing 4,000 years of inhabitation. Each layer, a different era in human history.
Here we have a cake, a period, a sequence of layers. Down there, 2500 BC, which means the pyramids in Egypt. Up there, layer 6, the Exodus of Egypt. The blue sign, the period of Jesus Christ. So we have a history of humanity and a wonderful sequence which we can control as archaeologists.
But Schliemann didn't know how to date his layers. And as the science of archaeology evolved, it became clear that these jewels could never have been worn by Helen. They were more than 1,000 years too old. Schliemann had dug down too deep. The late Bronze Age, the time of the legend, was 4 layers higher up.
Now, if there was a Trojan War, we would look to the layer 6, which is the fortification wall, which you can see over there.
A very different Troy emerged from that layer, with physical features that seemed to match some of Homer's descriptions. Here seemed to be his fine towers. His wide streets and lofty gates. The city was indeed well-walled, as the myth described. The city that emerged seemed to be drawn from the pages of Homer. Watchtowers dominating the land, as Homer described. But there was one feature that just didn't.
That it doesn't fit what Homer describes. Yes, it's wealthy. Yes, maybe powerful, maybe some trade, but there aren't enough people there. It's simply too small.
Once again, doubters suggested that there might be nothing to the myth at all. That perhaps Homer's Troy never existed. But even if this was not Homer's Troy, it was a fascinating archaeological site in its own right. And in 1988, it drew a large international team to begin work again. In charge was the leading German archaeologist Manfred Kaufmann. He was interested in science, not the myth. But his work was to lead to extraordinary new insights into the legend. It began when Kaufmann started to re-examine the citadel defenses.
We have here a fortification wall, in some places 8 meters high, still standing. Now, the purpose of this tower is actually, I would say, to show power and to make sure that this was a powerful residence. You see the greatness of this tower, you see the powerful thickness of these walls.
But then, it appeared to him that whoever had constructed the defenses had made an elementary mistake. It seemed there was no way of closing off the gateways. Any invading army could have just walked in.
Now, this gate is open and it is inviting everybody to come in. And so we went 100 times through it and thought how this was closed, how this was blocked, how could they defend themselves. Obviously they did not defend themselves here on the gate.
It just didn't make sense to him. No one would have built a city that was not defensible. So he began to wonder, perhaps these weren't the outside walls. Perhaps there was more to Troy than had so far been uncovered. Outside the city walls, Kaufmann's team began to excavate. They began to unearth remains from the late Bronze Age.
You have pithoi, which means storage jars, quite a number of it. We have found here a hearth in the middle, so it was warm. In the back rooms were two-storied, and we found in the corner something which we interpret as a kind of toilet.
Kaufmann began to speculate whether this was evidence that the city extended beyond the citadel walls into the fields below.
The big question is there a lower city? Now, is this the lower city? From the topographical point of view, this should be the lower city.
But the area was too big to excavate with spades. So Kaufmann had to try a different technique, magnetic imaging, to look beneath the surface. What was revealed was a city hidden beneath the fields. A grid of wide streets and long avenues. It was immediately obvious that this belonged to a much later period. Classical Greek and Roman times.
We find the Greek and Roman layout of the city with streets, with channels and so on. Wonderful to have such a city plan. But we were looking for the lower city of the Bronze Age and the end of the lower city.
At first, it seemed there was nothing here from the late Bronze Age. That later buildings had obliterated any remains. But then Kaufmann spotted one feature, so faint it could easily have been overlooked.
Then we got alerted by a fine line which alerted us. I just draw it here. It goes up and down, it goes inward and outwards, and there was a gate interruption, and it continued like this. So by this we had the idea we should excavate. What is this?
The excavation revealed a section of a deep ditch.
This magnificent ditch is cut into the rock, and we can follow it up 700 meters just around this hill crop.
Kaufmann believes it was designed to stop enemy chariots, and so marked the outer limit of the lower city. He dated remains in the ditch, and it was from the late Bronze Age.
And this means that we have now the southern limit, and we know that this was quite a substantial place here, all over here, and in the back over here. So I think we are speaking of a considerable lower city and a lot of effort to fortify it with this ditch.
A city of the late Bronze Age was now revealed. Kaufmann believes it was a sizable city, with a population of between 4,000 and 8,000. For the scientist not interested in the myth, it was an amazing breakthrough.
Now, the people who believe that there was a Homeric Troy, that means a city of substantial size and population, will be happy with this result.
The discovery of such a lower city is crucial, and the fact that Kaufmann has apparently discovered just such a lower town is wonderful. It may be what was necessary to put the finishing touches on the identification of this site as Troy.
After 3,000 years, the legendary city of Troy seemed to have become a reality. It seemed there was some historical truth in the myth. But there was still no evidence that Troy had been destroyed, as Homer said, by an enemy army. Then Kaufmann's team began to look for clues about the fate of Troy in the late Bronze Age. Soon they began to find evidence of violence. They began to uncover arrowheads in the lower city. It suggested close-quarter fighting. Kaufmann began to build up a picture of what had happened.
Now the evidence is burning and a catastrophe with fire. Then there are skeletons. We found, for example, a girl, I think 16, 17 years old, half buried. The feet were burned by fire. Half of the corpse was underground. This is strange. So a rapid burial within a public space inside the city. And we found sling pellets in heaps.
He believes these pellets had been assembled by the defenders of Troy and been abandoned after they lost the battle. It pointed to a clear conclusion.
It was a city which was besieged. It was a city which was defended, which protected itself. They lost the war, and obviously they were defeated.
Kaufmann had shown that Troy had been destroyed in a battle at the end of the Bronze Age, just as the legend had said it was. But there was one thing Kaufmann couldn't determine: who the attackers had been. That evidence would have to come from elsewhere. Homer said that the army that sacked Troy came from Greece, that it was led by the king of Mycenae, Agamemnon. And this whole era in Greek history has become known as Mycenaean. In the legend, 1,000 Mycenaean ships sail for Troy to bring Helen home. Their army besieges Troy for 10 years. But were the Greeks capable of mounting such an expedition together? And could it have been led by a king of Mycenae, like Agamemnon? These magnificent lions have guarded the palace at Mycenae for 3,000 years. In the late Bronze Age, Greece was carved up into independent kingdoms. Each ruler had his own palace. The mighty wall suggested this was the palace of an important king. But for the myth to have substance, this one had to be the most important of all. Home to the Greek king of kings. Professor Spiros Iacovidis has spent most of his career excavating Mycenae. He's part of a team that have just completed a groundbreaking study, an atlas that shows what Mycenae looked like during the Bronze Age, including the road system that linked it to the rest of the country.
We have the citadel of Mycenae here. This is the modern road, which goes up, the black one. And these are the remains of Mycenaean roads, these red things here. We have another road there, goes across the riverbed. This one, it makes a turn and goes east. The roads lead to all directions.
He believes that the road network that radiates out from the citadel suggests that Mycenae could have been at the political center of the Greek world.
It was the center of Mycenaean civilization. Therefore, we assume that it was also the political center of the Mycenaean states. And it was certainly one of the most powerful states. So it could very well have been in the middle of things, in the center of whatever expedition was mounted against the coast of Asia Minor, and therefore also against Troy.
His work implies that Homer may have been right when he said Mycenae was at the center of Greek power. But was there evidence that these were the mighty warriors described in the legend? Evidence that the Mycenaeans were indeed great warriors came when these graves within the citadel walls were excavated many years ago.
It was on this very spot here, in this circle of graves within the citadel walls of Mycenae, that the discovery of the lost civilization of the Mycenaeans was first made. We're standing here in a great circle of graves surrounded by massive slabs of stone with the retaining wall of the great ramp that leads up to the Mycenaean palace behind us.
Here were uncovered the rulers of this lost civilization.
The men were found lying wearing massive gold death masks and wonderful ceremonial armour.
It was a sensational discovery. For the first time, the world looked at the face of a Mycenaean warrior chief. This is a face from the late Bronze Age. Buried alongside it, weapons of war.
We find Mycenaean warriors sometimes buried with up to as many as 40 or 50 swords that they probably collected and used during their lifetime. There's a whole sort of military strength and a military feeling to the civilization of the Mycenaeans. So from the artifacts we can see it's very much a warrior culture.
This warrior culture that archaeology had revealed did seem to fit the warrior culture that Homer described in his story. But even so, there was nothing to link these great warriors to Troy. The myth says the Greeks sailed to Troy to win Helen back. That it was a war of love and vengeance. It makes a wonderful story, but it has never seemed very likely. Another possible motivation for a war began to emerge from the stones of Mycenae. That motivation was greed. Archaeologists have discovered that the rulers of Mycenae had undertaken an epic task: to build mighty new walls, to transform their citadel.
There's a massive rebuilding programme. A whole new section of the citadel is added, almost doubling the size of the fortified area.
To complete the work, Louise Schofield believes they would have needed great wealth. Supplies and food for an army of workers. And the latest technology to work with. Bronze.
The sophisticated, heroic palace civilization that you see spread across the mainland of Greece would have demanded huge resources. You had a palace here with your dependents, you'd have your army to feed. These civilizations here really depended on wealth.
But the problem the Mycenaeans faced was that they didn't have the natural resources that mattered. They had no tin to make bronze weapons and tools. Nor did they have gold. Their civilization was greedy for this wealth, and they had to get it somehow.
If these independent Mycenaean kingdoms were to band together to undertake an expedition like that to Troy, they're not going to be doing it for honour or for the love of a beautiful woman. They're going to be doing it because they want something. And what they're going to want over there really is access to wealth.
So the archaeological record at Mycenae does find evidence of a rich warrior culture. And it suggests a likely motive for these warriors to join battle: the search for wealth and loot. So was there something about Troy that would have attracted a people like the Mycenaeans in their quest for riches? A discovery on the seabed further down the coast from Troy hints at an answer. In 50 meters of water, a shipwreck. Archaeologist Jamal Pulak was called to investigate.
Going down there and seeing rows and rows of these copper ingots was just absolutely unbelievable. We're extremely excited, and the more we looked around, the more was available, and it was quite apparent that we were dealing with a very, very large major wreck of the Bronze Age.
There were enough metal ingots to make 11 tons of bronze.
The cargo that the ship was carrying is by far the largest assemblage of Bronze Age goods found anywhere.
On board the ship, a dazzling cargo from the late Bronze Age. Beautifully shaped gold. Ostrich eggs from Africa or Asia. Goods from all over the known world on this single ship.
This gives us a clear idea of how intricate and how far-reaching the ancient trade network is. It's much, much more sophisticated than we would have initially thought.
Pulak's discovery suggested the late Bronze Age was a time of rich trade, of great wealth being moved across the high seas. Laden with bronze and treasure, ships like this could easily have called in at Troy.
These ships were obviously sturdy enough and capable enough to be able to sail northward into the Aegean and onto Troy.
Discoveries like these beg the question: was there something special about Troy's position in these trade routes that might have attracted the attention of the Mycenaeans? Manfred Kaufmann believes that Troy was a very special trading port indeed, that it occupied a vital strategic position. It sits at the edge of the Dardanelles, a narrow channel that separates Europe and Asia. Today, it's a vital trade route. And Kaufmann believes it was important 3,000 years ago.
Now it is the straits which are so narrow here that everything you could expect of contact between Asia and Europe should have passed here. So Troy could have benefited from this special geographic situation. And I think that's why it is so big in comparison to other sites. In this area, there's no site as important as Troy.
Kaufmann believes that Troy became a wealthy city because of this strategic position at the gateway between two continents. So it seems Troy was a very desirable city. Desirable to the Mycenaeans because of its wealth. But its position also made it desirable to someone else. Because Troy stood at the edge of another great civilization of the day. They were called the Hittites. Their empire covered much of the territory of modern-day Turkey. The Hittites were a superpower of the late Bronze Age. They'd sacked the ancient city of Babylon and fought the mighty army of the pharaohs to a standstill. But the Hittites have also left behind clues about what really might have happened at Troy. It is all contained in a vast collection of written tablets. Trevor Bryce has studied this astonishing collection. Remarkable accounts of what was happening to cities across the Hittite Empire more than 3,000 years ago.
They have really unlocked the key to an understanding of the whole history and civilization of the Hittite world. They give us pictures of conflicts and tensions in that region, and that really provides us with an actual historical written record.
So scholars began to look for references to Troy in the texts. It appeared to be a hopeless task, because no one knew what the Hittites had called the place. Then they started to discover references to battles over an important city. Its name was Wilusha, a name very similar to another ancient Greek name for Troy, Wilios.
Many scholars believed that a country called Wilusha in Hittite texts was in fact the name of Troy.
The tablets described festering conflicts involving the Mycenaeans all along the coast by Wilusha. Conflicts spread over 200 years. The tablets stated, Mycenaean warriors had once fought at the gates of Wilusha. If scholars could show that Troy and Wilusha were the same place, they could then compare the legend against historical records. The tablets might at last reveal the real truth of Troy. But it wasn't to be a simple task.
The problem was we couldn't really prove it because we didn't know exactly where Wilusha lay.
This was the task for archaeology, to discover if Troy and Wilusha were the same city. A recent breakthrough has given us the answer. It involved a mysterious message on a mountain, inspired detective work, and following an army on the move. The first clue came from a tablet that recorded that the military might of the Hittites was being unleashed in the late Bronze Age.
The Hittite army is on the move from its homeland. We know it's moving westwards, and we know that its final destination is the kingdom of Wilusha. But we didn't know precisely where Wilusha lay. In fact, it could have been anywhere along this coastline. At all events, we know that the Hittite army continued to move westwards. But then, did they go north or did they go south?
Troy is situated in the north. So if Troy and Wilusha are the same place, then the Hittite army should have headed north. But the tablet offered no clue. The direction the army must have taken was finally revealed when the inscription on this mountain pass was deciphered. It marked the boundary between two kingdoms and indicated the Hittite army had headed north.
Once they reached close to the western coast, they then turned northwards, bringing them right up into the region of where Troy was located. So really, the conclusion now seems inescapable. The kingdoms of Wilusha and Troy Ilion are one and the same.
The scholarly evidence was compelling. The mythical city of Troy and the Hittite city of Wilusha may well be the same. But what was missing now was supporting archaeological evidence. That evidence was to come from the water tunnel that Manfred Kaufmann had excavated at Troy. And the breakthrough was to do with dating the tunnel. Most people believe this tunnel had been built 1,000 years after the late Bronze Age. But Kaufmann was less sure.
Outside there are basins of Roman period, so it is a Roman structure, a Roman tunnel system, but then we were suspicious that it is older.
The reason the date of the tunnel mattered so much was because of this tablet. It contains a reference to a water tunnel at Wilusha. So if this tunnel at Troy was from the same time as the tablet, here would be archaeological evidence that Troy and Wilusha were the same place. Everything now depended on the date of the tunnel. But was there anything in it to date? Then Kaufmann noticed that over the centuries, water had seeped into the cave walls and left behind it layers of limestone. It's the same process that furs up your kettle. Here it's left slabs on the side of the cave.
So here is the outer surface. That means the last time that water was coming, pouring through it. It's like a teapot, this calcareous matter, pouring through the rocks and accumulating here. This is the inside when it started.
Kaufmann then realized that the limestone layers contained something he could use to date the tunnel. Tiny quantities of uranium. Back in the lab, Kaufmann's team analyzed the minute amounts of naturally occurring uranium in the cave limestone. The uranium undergoes radioactive decay at a predictable rate. They used a mass spectrometer to measure the decay, and so determine how old the tunnel was. When the result came back, it was astonishing. The tunnel had been started in 2600 BC, and it had been in use when the Hittite tablet was written. Science had delivered the supporting evidence. Troy and Volusia were the same city. We can now build up a likely scenario of what might have happened to Troy. The tablets show that the Mycenaeans had fought at Troy in the late Bronze Age.
The Hittite texts mention battles that took place. The Hittite records indicate furthermore that the Mycenaeans were not only interested in this region, but had been actively fighting on and off for more than 2 centuries.
The tablets show that Troy was an ally of the Hittites. If Troy was attacked, the Hittites were likely to come and fight alongside them. So Homer's legend appears to have been based on a real conflict between 2 superpowers of the late Bronze Age, the Mycenaeans and the Hittites.
I believe that these conflicts were distilled into a tradition of a single war lasting 10 years.
It seems the war occurred because Troy was a wealthy city in a vital strategic location, and that both superpowers wanted to control it.
Was the Trojan War fought for love? No. Was it fought because of greed, for money, for territory, for ambition? Of course. It's what most wars are fought for. Troy was caught between 2 mighty empires, the Mycenaeans and the Hittites. It was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and it was crushed.
So there was no face that launched 1,000 ships. The war, or wars, were not fought for love, but more likely for gold and loot. And what of the Trojan horse? There are no clues in the texts, nor in the archaeological record. Perhaps it just shows that Homer really was, above all, an amazing storyteller.